Welcome to Central Bank Central. I'm Kathleen Hayes. Well, it's been barely 48 hours since President Trump finally announced his nominee to be the next Federal Reserve chair. A lot of talk now about Kevin Warsh. He's a former Fed governor himself. What he's done since he was at the Fed, when he was the head at the Fed before, and what he might do or should do or could do if and when he does get that final okay. But at this point, it looks like President Trump is probably going to sail through with whomever is going to have to do all the voting to get Kevin Warsh in that chair, replacing Jay Powell. So let's get right to Ellen Meade. Ellen Meade is someone who currently, and has been for a while, at Duke University as a research professor and in the economics department, of course. She spent about 25 years at the Federal Reserve Board, 12 years in academia mixed in with that. She had some pretty important positions there. She was a special advisor to the Fed Board of Governors and to then Vice Chair Rich Clarida, senior advisor in the Division of Monetary Affairs, another very important part of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in the policymaking process. In fact, she played a key role in the Federal Reserve's new framework for monetary policy, which was put in place in 2020. Also, the Fed Listens initiative, I should say, which preceded that. So it's great to have you back on Central Bank Central. Thanks for joining
Thank
today.
you very much. Good to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here, and especially when we're talking about uh, this universe, this Fed universe that where you were such an important part because the Fed chair, you worked with the vice chair so closely, you did so much of this. Kevin Warsh, it took the president a while to decide, and it's everyone's kind of, was it going to be this one? The markets have been uncertain. I would assume at the Fed, you're kind of wondering what the heck, who your next boss is going to be. Um, how does it feel now, do you think, at the within the Fed and outside the Fed to finally know who this is, who Trump has selected?
Well, I think it's time. It was becoming a distraction. This on again, off again. Is this person? Is it Hassett? Is it Warsh? Is it Waller? Is it Reader? And all the market betting and stuff. I think it's time, and it's also good positioning vis-a-vis May. Needs to be some time to schedule the hearings and get Warsh approved, so that he can take over when Pell's term expires. I think that's an important for the transition process. So I think the selection process issue had become a bit of a distraction, frankly, and I'm pleased to see it over.
Sure, and there's been enough distraction from the whole Fed independence debate and all that. But let's get to Kevin Warsh. He was on the Board of Governors
Mhm.
from what, 2006
Hmm.
to 2011.
Yep.
So he was
Hmm.
there at the very beginning of and the heat of the great financial crisis. He's a Fed insider in that regard. Is it important that he is a Fed insider, or at least a former Fed insider?
I think so. I think it's a complex institution with a lot of responsibilities and a wide range of staff. He gets off the ground running if he has some internal knowledge. So, of the serious candidates, who were the two who really have that? It's Waller and Warsh. I was always hoping that one of them would get the nod simply because I think, even if you want to make changes to the institution, it's good to sort of have an understanding of what that institution is. And he gets high marks from the people who worked with him when he was there before. And I wasn't among them because that was during my period in academia. But I know quite well a lot of people, former division directors and so on, who work very closely with him. Bernanke's always been quite complimentary of his contributions during the global financial crisis. He played a key role in some of the dialogue with financial market participants that was so important. He worked very closely with Nellie Lang, who then he worked to establish that original Office of Financial Stability after the GFC because the Fed felt it needed more surveillance of financial stability issues. That office eventually became a division. Nellie was its first division director. All the staff I know who worked very closely with him, amongst the very senior staff, felt he was a solid guy. I mean, you
Yeah.
could say he's not an economist, and there are some people who would prefer a Waller-style trained economist to a Warsh or Pal not trained economist. I think I would sometimes put myself in that camp as well. But I think in this case, maybe what we need, and I think he shows that he has that, is the close relationships with financial markets and also maybe an ability to work with Scott Bessent. The president can be,
The Treasury Secretary, for those who
yes,
don't
the
follow this quite
Treasury
as closely as we do.
Secretary. Yeah. I think if it's okay if I segue into a sort of slightly different part of the answer, I think President Trump can sometimes say things that roil financial markets and get them all worked up.
Yes.
And Bessent has been very good at working both the inside of the internal processes inside of the White House and then calming things down on the outside.
Okay.
And I think Warsh may be a companion in that, in a
Oh,
way that
okay.
Waller maybe wasn't because of his background. Maybe Waller couldn't fill that role in the same way.
And I want to remind everybody again, Chris Waller, St. Louis Fed Director of Research, big partner alongside Jim Bullard, who was the head of the St. Louis
Yes.
Fed for a long
Yes.
time. So he monetary policy,
Yes.
in his blood, right?
Macroeconomics,
For
all of
years.
that, but
Yes, yes,
not
yes.
not closely connected to financial market participants.
Well, yeah.
Maybe not as, I think Warsh will be pretty smooth in navigating the
Okay.
relationships with Congress and all of that. So this external dimension, I think, probably played a role, maybe
Sure.
in Bessent, Scott, as Secretary Bessent, even you know, uh, advising the president that this was the right
Sure.
choice. I have no idea, right? I'm not inside of that, but
Well,
but I could
it's certain.
imagine that's
Sure, 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 sure. That
important.
there was some kind of a, what's the word I want? When you kind of m mesh well with somebody, you're kind of in the same, that you've got that two sides. Kevin Warsh already had been on the Board of Governors. Yes, he wasn't a trained economist. However, he was very good on the financial stability part, right? And you just
Right.
mentioned, and he was the impetus behind the creation of the Fed's Division of Financial Stability. Do you think this means that he's going to pay more attention to potentially destabilizing issues in the markets if and when they should come along?
Gee, I don't know. I mean, um, the so far the vice chair for supervision, Mickey Bowman, who was a Trump governor appointee, and he appointed her to be vice chair of supervision, is looking to kind of dismantle, should we say, or really pare back the Fed's functioning in that area. Um, I would hope that they continue that obviously this division that follows financial stability is totally separate from the division that does banking supervision and regulation, but they're very closely linked in terms of what the intention is, right? Is to make sure our financial system is safe and to make sure we're monitoring and this kind of thing. And I would hope that Warsh doesn't feel it's a good time for the Fed to pare back on its financial stability monitoring in this age of stable coins and all sorts of other
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
So, in terms of Kevin Warsh, it's interesting that he does have a bit of a reputation as inflation hawk. When he was, at the board, when the financial crisis was starting, he was they were cutting rates, right? But he was still looking at inflation, right? Back then. And this is, of course, at a time when he's, going to work for a president who has been pounding the table forever about more rate cuts, more rate cuts. And this also at a time when inflation has been above target for nearly 5 years now. So how's that going to play out?
Yeah, that's a hard needle to thread. You're right. He's been a really consistent inflation hawk. And he's been particularly critical of the Fed and the inflation that came about during the pandemic. Um, I, I don't know. Clearly, some of the arguments he's been making suggest that, if these benefits to AI, these sort of productivity shifts, uh, manifest themselves and people look back to the late 1990s during the internet and the increase in productivity, and Alan Greenspan pushing back on some of the dovish members of the FOMC who wanted to start raising rates and saying, no, I think we're getting a productivity boost. I don't think this is going to be, something that's inconsistent with our policy. And, Warsh has been making similar types of statements. So then the question comes, if that productivity shift doesn't manifest itself and he's wrong, and inflation is sort of not slowing to two or even starting to pick up, which side of it would he pick? Right.
Okay.
And I sort of feel that um, he, in his gut, is an inflation hawk. His whole support comes from the community that are inflation hawks, even if they were wrong about inflation resulting after the GFC, which it didn't, but it did result after the pandemic, and they've been pretty critical of that. So I think he has a tremendous skills, both politically, maybe the relationship with Besant, the relationship with financial markets. I wouldn't be surprised if, Besant himself, you've got to have some worries in the back of your mind. Maybe this easing of policy that Trump wants really is the wrong idea. And we have to be able to navigate that. I think Warsh, of all the candidates, might be the one most able to do it. So I'm hoping that
When you
his
say
inflation
most
hawk
able to do it,
side is really the one that survives, right? If he
right?
needs to, right?
Okay. So, but when you say you think he might be the one to do it, do you think it's sort of like, well, if you're somebody, um, that Trump would be less likely to accept, hey, we really have to be careful about inflation right now from somebody else who does not have the same kind of background in the connection with financial markets. And he's also he's somebody who's been in this system very closely connected to markets for many years, right? That's a good thing, I would think, for the president. Do you think that's what put him in a better position to for Trump to go, okay? But it's not just to be like pounding Powell, your
Mhm.
first term, your second term, and that he's somebody who can then help the Fed be more independent ultimately.
I hope so. And I'm willing to give him that benefit of the doubt. I do think that after all this politicization and the attack on Lisa Cook and then the attack on Powell and the building and all the stuff that's been going on that really is challenging Fed independence, we need to pull back as commentators and so on and give this guy a chance to really take hold. I do think there is, if he's going to navigate around inflation and get inflation back down to two without some very, very positive shocks that push the economy that direction, he's going to have to navigate around that terrain. And I think, I hope he has. I think he is committed to Fed's independence. Now, the real question comes when the staff gives him a forecast that says that,
The
inflation
board
is
staff,
the
board of
board
governors staff,
staff.
yeah,
Yeah,
very
the board
important group.
staff plays a very integral role. There are many, many of them. They put together the key forecast that is the baseline for discussion at an FOMC meeting. That doesn't mean you agree with it or I agree with it. I might have my own forecast, but it really forms this. It's very detailed. So you have to then position yourself relative to it. And so as he starts to think about that, what evidence is he using? If he really, one scenario you could imagine, if you really feel I've got to deliver on Trump's rate cuts, you've then got to bring in different economists to deliver that forecast,
I see.
right?
Yeah.
I think the board staff, given what Powell says is at his press conferences, they came to some conclusion at some point that the pass-through effects of tariffs weren't going to be all that great, in part because the tariffs weren't all as high as
Mm-hmm.
originally anticipated and because of some of the composition effects. And pretty much everybody these days, outside forecasters, sounds like inside the Fed, have inflation peaking in the first or second quarter. Those tariff effects will then die back.
Right.
Okay. Um, so the Fed staff even has inflation coming back to 2%, right?
Right.
Um, if I'm not sure that calls for rate cuts. I think
True.
it depends on what manifests in
It,
terms of the labor market and in terms of other things. I bet, my gut is that he will keep the staff. He understands the value of the staff. He won't try to engineer things so internally he gets um,
okay.
a forecast that supports the Trump cuts, right? So, will it be on the table? He probably will have it on the table. But
We'll see.
as has been pointed out by everybody, you've got 12 voting members of the FOMC. They have to buy
That's
your
right.
arguments. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a good thing to remind everybody. Yes, yes, yes. He's a chair, but he's got to get everybody on board. And it may be that the monetary policy gods are going to favor Kevin Warsh because inflation will come down. Now that remains to be seen. People expect it to. A lot of people forecasting that. Still, but there's a lot of economic numbers are strong. But kind of stepping back a bit here, Kevin Warsh has been affiliated with Stanford in the Graduate Business School, the Hoover Institution, right?
Mhm.
In terms of the kinds of research he's done. So that means he knows John Taylor pretty well, right? He
Mhm.
knows about rules versus discretion. What about that? What do you think? Is there anything we know Kevin has said recently, or even in the past several years, about how, because that could also then give some guidance as to how much he can lead in a certain direction and whether he should lead in a direction. What do you think there, Ellen?
So I think it's underappreciated the role that rules actually play inside the institution. I'm very proud of the fact that I got put into the monetary policy report in 2017, a box on monetary policy rules, so that we could discuss how we use rules internally and the variety of rules that are consulted. And the issues involved if you stuck yourself to one particular rule rather than a menu of rules that the FOMC sees regularly at every FOMC meeting. And we also added some other material to describe how rules are used. I think that's quite a rich set of resources on in the monetary policy part of the board's website for people who choose to consult it. And of course, we have the Taylor Rule Utility out of, I think it is the Atlanta Fed. There are a lot of rules
Right,
supporting information. A lot of policymakers talk in terms of rules, which rule they're more sympathetic to. I think, the slavish following of a rule could be associated with a number of adverse consequences because one specific rule, they're so parsimonious, these rules, they don't really include a lot of the details of an
right.
economy, but you do need to look at them. You need to think carefully about them. And I do think it's underappreciated by members of Congress sometimes, and also by outsiders, how much rules are part of the discussion. I don't think, I would be surprised if he pushes the FOMC to adopt literally one
Uh,
specific formulation of a rule. He may use that more in his own communicating. And
sure,
there's
sure.
plenty of it available to use, right?
Right,
So
right.
I could see that. Um, uh, but I think, I do think he's been an inflation hawk. It's a little hard to square with as we just discussed, with the Trump um, call for lower rates. I think Warsh has made an argument that, if it were to be true, could position him well. But if he can't deliver that, I don't think he will. And I think that's good for the institution. At least I want to allow him scope, you know?
Yeah.
I
Yes.
think where he's been also very critical of the Fed is on the balance sheet and balance sheet policies. And I do think that there's more room there to deliver. Okay.
Okay,
And
so quickly, just in a
yeah,
sentence, balance sheet policy, what is it that he's pushing for? What, because a lot of people, again,
yes,
outside of our direct
yes,
circle, what's that mean? Just a
yes.
quick what
So, his leaving the Fed in early 2011 was shortly after the FOMC voted to approve the second LSAP program, large scale asset purchase program, back in November 2010. And he did vote for that program. But when he resigned, he wrote an op-ed, I believe, in the Wall Street Journal, saying that he did not favor the use of the Fed's balance sheet, meaning expanding the Fed's balance sheet, purchasing securities and putting money in the accounts of the commercial banks uh, accounts at the Fed. He didn't agree with that for macroeconomic stimulus reasons.
Okay.
And the Fed had by 2010, the financial crisis proper is over, right?
Hmm. Okay.
Um, and as we talked about, Warsh had been very, very key in the discussions around all these various liquidity facilities, sometimes called 13(3) facilities, the
Right.
various loans that were made. But then the Fed was transitioning away from, in its initial QE, the Fed had been focused on stabilizing financial
Yeah.
markets,
So,
and
so
Warsh
right.
supported that,
Yeah,
right?
but that's the big question.
Yes.
You do that, but you don't keep doing QE and putting in more reserves, is it? Because you want to help the economy. So where are we now?
Well,
Is
I
it
think I
possible
think
for
his
him to?
argument at the time was it would be inflationary, which it was not. The
Right. Okay.
economy was severely impaired after the global financial crisis. As it turned out, businesses just built up those accounts with the Fed and didn't lend them on because they were so worried about making loans.
Okay. So where
Where
are we
where the
now?
Fed gets really criticized is because it did it again on steroids during the pandemic, even though plenty of fiscal support was forthcoming. So he's been very critical of that. The Fed needs to rethink and articulate its goals, its pros and cons, and the rules around using of QE, both for market functioning purposes. What does it see as the role in market functioning? Are there limits there? What are they? And around the use for macroeconomic stabilization. What would be the kickoff of that? How would you
Okay.
assess it? So I think there needs to be a fundamental review of that. My understanding is that Powell did not want to undertake that as part of the framework review, the 2020 framework review. And I do understand the mindset of
Okay.
that. That framework is about, maximum employment and
Okay.
price stability,
Okay.
not about, but I think, maybe they're on the verge of doing it now. They need to do it. They need to come out and say, this is what we did using QE during the pandemic. Here's
Okay. And is this
where
what
it
you
was right.
expect?
Here's where we went off track. And I think he will lead that discussion. I hope to see a lot of it's going to take them a while. These
Sure, sure, sure.
discussions take a while. They only meet every 6 weeks. They only have the time that they have, and it's a little like Peyton Place. You pick up from the last episode and you keep going.
Okay.
So
Well,
maybe you need, he comes in May, maybe by December, they can articulate
okay.
something.
But you
Um,
support that and you support that aspect of Kevin Warsh.
Yes. And I think,
Okay.
this whole discussion of whether it would be in the context of a renewed Treasury Fed accord, which was the 1951
Right.
accord between Treasury and the Fed that kind of said the Fed's independent. It's not going to purchase, at that time it was about pegging
Right.
longer term
Okay.
interest rates.
Okay.
Um, you could see use of the balance sheet and the parameters around that use
Okay.
involving the Treasury. I don't think it has to, but it might make it stronger if it
Okay.
did. I don't know. But that has been something that's been mentioned, right?
Okay. Yeah. Well, something about where you are very knowledgeable and you so many years where you spent so many times in the deep heart of this. And now, of course, you're teaching at Duke, the economics department, and taking a little time out for me today to talk about Kevin Morse and all the various issues of what he's looking at now and what he's going to be looking at next. Okay.
Good.
Ellen, me, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I'm Kathleen Hayes, and this is Central Bank Central.